The explosion rocked Captain James Miller's ship as he maneuvered through the debris field. Around him, the void of space lit up with weapons fire as Coalition forces engaged the last Vex battle group. "Status report," James barked, gripping his command chair as another blast shook the deck. "Shields at 60%, Captain." "Enemy formation breaking apart," reported his tactical officer, eyes fixed on the glowing display. James nodded grimly. After 10 years of brutal conflict, the war was finally ending. His squadron had been tasked with leading the assault on the Vex flagship, a mission that would either end the fighting or fail spectacularly. "All ships, focus fire on their command vessel," James ordered. "This ends today." The Coalition fleet responded immediately, concentrating their attack on the massive Vex ship at the center of their formation. Its hull was unlike anything humans had built, organic curves mixed with sharp angles, covered in a material that seemed to shift colors under fire. James had fought the Vex for so long that he sometimes forgot why the war had started. Something about territorial disputes in the Orion Arm, resources on shared border planets. Now, it just felt like they had always been fighting. 3 more Vex ships exploded in quick succession. Their remaining vessels began to pull back, clearly outmatched. The Coalition fighters pressed forward, sensing victory. "They're broadcasting a signal, Captain," his communications officer announced with surprise. It's a surrender code." A heavy silence fell over the bridge. After a decade of losses and sacrifice, it seemed impossible that it could end so suddenly. "Confirm that," James ordered, not daring to hope. "Signal confirmed. The Vex Supreme Commander requests to meet with the Coalition leadership." Hours later, James found himself aboard the neutral station where the formal surrender would take place. As one of the senior field commanders, he stood with Coalition generals and admirals as the Vex delegation approached. The aliens moved with an unsettling grace despite their tall, angular bodies. Their skin had a faint blue-gray shine under the station's lights, and their 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern, blinked independently as they surveyed the humans. The Vex Supreme Commander stepped forward, his elaborate armor marking his rank. He spoke in the clicking, musical language of his people before his words were translated by the device at his throat. "The Vex Empire acknowledges defeat and accepts the terms of surrender as outlined by your council." James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. He could finally go home. But then the commander did something unexpected. He turned directly to James and gestured to a smaller figure who had remained hidden behind the delegation. A young Vex female stepped forward, her features softer than the warriors but unmistakably alien. "Captain Miller." The commander addressed him directly. "You led the final assault with both skill and honor. You fought fiercely but showed mercy when possible." James tensed, unsure where this was going. "In accordance with our oldest traditions, I bestow upon you the greatest honor a defeated warrior can offer." The commander gently pushed the young Vex forward. "This is my daughter, Lyra. By right of victory, I entrust her future to you." The room fell silent. James stared in confusion. "I don't understand," he finally managed. "In Vex culture, those who defeat us honorably inherit responsibility for our young," the commander explained. "She is now yours to protect and guide. This is our way." James looked at the alien girl, barely more than a teenager by human standards, who stared back with a mixture of fear and defiance in her 4 eyes. "Sir, I can't possibly," James began. "To refuse would dishonor the peace we have just established," the commander said quietly. "Please, the war has taken her mother and soon her father's position. She needs a guardian who understands honor." James swallowed hard, looking from the young Vex to his superior officers, who appeared as shocked as he felt. The war was over, but his most challenging mission was just beginning. James paced the small quarters assigned to him aboard the Coalition flagship. The young Vex girl sat motionless on the edge of the bed, her 4 eyes following his movements. "This is insane," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I'm a soldier, not a guardian." Certainly not for an alien teenager. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her blue-gray skin catching the light. The translation device the Vex had provided hung around her neck, similar to her father's. "My father chose you specifically," she said, her voice coming through the device with an artificial flatness. "He studied your battle records. You showed mercy to our civilian transports when others would have destroyed them." James stopped pacing. "That's just basic decency. It doesn't qualify me to raise someone from another species." "I do not need raising," Lyra responded, a hint of pride in her otherwise mechanical voice. "I am 17 cycles, nearly an adult by Vex standards." A knock at the door interrupted them. Admiral Petrov entered without waiting for permission, his weathered face twisted with concern. "Miller, what exactly are we supposed to do with this situation?" he asked, gesturing toward Lyra. "Sir, I'm as confused as you are," James admitted. "Apparently, this is some kind of Vex honor tradition. Our cultural office has confirmed it," Petrov sighed. "It's a legitimate practice among their warrior class. Refusing would be considered a grave insult and might jeopardize the peace agreement." Lyra stood suddenly, her tall, thin frame making her nearly as tall as the Admiral despite her youth. "I am not a burden to be discussed as if I cannot understand," she said firmly. "My father entrusted me to Captain Miller because he believed humans capable of honor. Was he mistaken?" The Admiral and James exchanged uncomfortable glances. "No one's saying that," James replied carefully. "But I'm being discharged next month. I'm going back to Earth. What happens to you then?" "I accompany you," Lyra said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. "That is the arrangement. An alien living on Earth." Petrov shook his head. "There will be paperwork, tests, quarantine, medical examinations, security clearances. Then we will complete these things," Lyra responded simply. Later that evening, after the Admiral had left with promises to sort this mess out, James sat across from Lyra in the small dining area of his quarters. She examined the standard military ration with obvious suspicion. "Your food lacks proper nutrients for my biology," she observed. "The medical team is working on that," James replied. "They'll synthesize something appropriate." Lyra set down the ration pack. "You did not wish for this responsibility." It wasn't a question, but James answered anyway. "No, I didn't. I've spent 10 years fighting a war. I was looking forward to peace and quiet. Yet you accepted. I didn't have much choice." "There is always choice," Lyra said, her 4 eyes blinking in their unsettling diamond pattern. "My father chose you because he believed you would make the right one." James leaned back in his chair. "And what do you think?" For the first time, Lyra's posture changed, her shoulders lowering slightly. "I think I have lost everything familiar to me. My home, my culture. Soon, my father. I am being sent to live among former enemies on a planet with different gravity, atmosphere, and customs." She paused. "I am afraid." The admission surprised James. He'd been so caught up in his own confusion that he hadn't fully considered her perspective. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This can't be easy for you either." "So we are both victims of circumstance," Lyra observed. "Perhaps we can help each other navigate this unexpected path." James considered her words. Maybe the young alien was right. They were both soldiers in their own way, facing an uncertain future neither had chosen. "One step at a time," he finally said. "First, let's figure out what you can eat. Then we'll worry about Earth." Lyra's mouth formed what might have been a Vex approximation of a smile. "A wise battle strategy, Captain Miller." The shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, rattling slightly as it cut through clouds. James glanced at Lyra, who sat rigidly in her specially modified seat. The higher gravity of Earth had required her to wear a partial exosuit that compensated for the difference. "How are you feeling?" James asked. "The pressure is intense," Lyra replied, her 4 eyes narrowed in concentration. "But manageable. The atmosphere composition readings are within my tolerance range. That's not what I meant, James said quietly. Lyra turned to look at him. After 3 weeks aboard the Coalition ship, he was getting better at reading her alien expressions. Right now, she was nervous. I have studied your Earth extensively from our data archives, she said, but experiencing it directly will be different. The shuttle touched down at the military landing pad in Seattle. Rain pattered against the windows, a perfectly typical Pacific Northwest welcome. Your planet leaks, Lyra observed. James laughed despite himself. That's just rain. You'll get used to it. As they disembarked, a small welcoming committee waited under the shelter of the terminal. Military officials, a medical team, and the sight made James's heart leap. His sister Kate. James. Kate rushed forward, wrapping him in a fierce hug. Thank God you're home. When she pulled back, her eyes went immediately to Lyra, who stood awkwardly behind him. To her credit, Kate's expression registered surprise for only a moment before she smiled. And you must be Lyra, she said. James told me about you in his messages. Welcome to Earth. Lyra made the formal Vex greeting gesture. I am grateful for your welcome, sister of James. Just Kate is fine, she replied with a warm smile. The military officials approached next, along with the medical team. Captain Miller, we'll need to complete processing and medical screening before you can leave the base, a stern-faced colonel informed them. Hours later, after endless forms, medical tests, and security briefings, they were finally cleared to leave. James's old truck waited in the parking lot, and Lyra examined it with obvious suspicion. This transportation method appears primitive and unsafe, she observed. It gets the job done, James replied as he loaded their bags. My house is about an hour from here. The drive to James's home in the wooded outskirts of the city was quiet. Lyra pressed against the window, watching the landscape with all 4 eyes wide open. The trees seemed to fascinate her most of all. Your planet has so much life, she finally said. Vex worlds are more mineral than organic. We terraform differently. James's home came into view as they rounded the final curve. A modest cabin nestled among tall pines, with a small workshop out back. He had purchased it just before his last deployment, dreaming of the day he could return to it in peace. It's not much, he said as he parked, but it's home. It is constructed of plant material, Lyra observed with surprise. Is this common? Pretty common, yeah. We call it wood. Inside, Kate had prepared the house for their arrival. Fresh food stocked the refrigerator, and she had converted the small office into a bedroom for Lyra, complete with a reinforced bed frame to accommodate the specialized sleeping platform the military had provided. I wasn't sure what you might need, Kate explained to Lyra. But I got those supplements the doctors recommended, and I can help you order anything else. Lyra stood in the center of the room, looking smaller somehow despite her height. Her fingers traced the edge of a wooden shelf. This is to be my territory now, she said quietly. James and Kate exchanged glances. It's your home, James corrected gently. For as long as you need it to be. That evening, as rain tapped against the roof, James sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Kate joined him, pulling her jacket tighter against the chill. She's not what I expected, Kate admitted. What did you expect? I don't know. Something more. Alien, I guess. But she just seems like a lost kid. James nodded slowly. I think that's exactly what she is. Inside, they could see Lyra carefully examining the bookshelf, running her slender fingers over the spines of books as if they were precious artifacts. You always wanted to be a father, Kate said with a small smile. Not like this, James replied, but found himself watching Lyra with growing protectiveness. Not like this at all. 3 weeks into their new living arrangement, James sat across from Principal Roberts in the cramped office of Pinecrest High School. The older man adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the unusual application papers. I understand this is unconventional, James said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "That's putting it mildly, Captain Miller," Roberts replied, glancing up. "We've had exchange students from around the world, but never from another planet. Lyra needs education and socialization. The military advisors think integration is the best approach." Roberts sighed heavily. "And how do you propose we handle the fact that she has 4 eyes and blue skin?" The other students. "We'll need to adapt," James interrupted firmly. "Just like she's adapting to our gravity, our food, our air." Outside the office, Lyra waited on a bench, her slender frame hunched forward as she studied a tablet. Despite her alien features, James had helped her adopt clothing that wouldn't stand out too dramatically. Jeans, a loose hoodie that partially shadowed her face, and specially made shoes for her differently structured feet. Eventually, Principal Roberts reluctantly agreed to a trial period. They created a cover story that Lyra was part of a specialized exchange program and developed a modified curriculum that accounted for her advanced understanding of mathematics and science, while focusing on her need to learn Earth history and culture. The first day of school arrived with tense anticipation. James drove Lyra to the campus, parking away from the main crowd. "Remember what we practiced," he said. "Try not to stare at anyone with all 4 eyes at once. It makes humans uncomfortable." "I understand," Lyra nodded. "I should also not mention the inefficiencies in your mathematical systems or the primitive nature of your technology." James winced. "Right. And maybe don't refer to anything as primitive. Your language has many unnecessary taboos," she observed. As they walked toward the building, students turned to stare. Even with the hoodie, Lyra's alien nature was impossible to completely disguise. Whispers followed them through the hallway. "Is that her? The alien girl? They say she's from that species we were just at war with. My dad says they shouldn't let her kind on Earth." Lyra's posture stiffened, but she kept walking, eyes fixed forward. James left her at the door to her first class, feeling as if he were abandoning her to wolves. "I'll pick you up at 3, he promised, "if you need anything." "I have the communication device," she said, patting her pocket where the phone rested. "I will be fine, Captain Miller." "James," he corrected gently. "Remember, here I'm just James." By lunchtime, James had received 3 texts from the school. Lyra had corrected her physics teacher on advanced gravitational theory. She had refused to change for gym class, explaining that exposure of limbs was offensive in Vex culture. And she was now sitting alone in the cafeteria, no other student willing to join her table. James was about to call her when a final text came through, this time from Lyra herself. "A human girl named Becky has asked about Vex music. I believe this is a positive cultural exchange." That evening, Lyra sat at the kitchen table, carefully completing her homework assignments with meticulous precision. "How was it, really?" James asked. Lyra was quiet for a moment. "Humans fear what they do not understand," she finally said. "This is true of Vex as well. It is why we fought for so long." "Does that mean it was terrible?" "No," she said, surprising him. "One girl asked real questions. A boy in mathematics appreciated my help with equations. The teacher in history class asked me to share Vex perspectives." She looked up at him. Small connections, like roots beginning to grow. James nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and concern. "That's a good start. My father once told me that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding," Lyra said quietly. "Perhaps that is what he hoped for when he sent me here." For the first time, James wondered if the Vex commander had given him not just a responsibility, but a purpose, building a bridge between their worlds, one awkward school day at a time. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. "One day at a time." James woke to the sound of breaking glass. He reached for the pistol he kept in his bedside drawer before remembering he wasn't in a war zone anymore. Still, old instincts died hard. The crash came from Lyra's room. He found her standing by her broken window, blue skin almost luminescent in the moonlight. Sharp glass fragments littered the floor around her bare feet. "Lyra, are you hurt?" he asked, rushing toward her. "I am unharmed," she replied calmly, but her 4 eyes were fixed on something outside. "They have gone now." James peered through the broken window. In the yard below, he could make out footprints in the mud, and something spray-painted on the side of his workshop. "Aliens go home." "This is the 3rd incident this month," Lyra observed. James sighed heavily. It had been almost 2 months since Lyra had started school, and while some kids had gradually accepted her, others had not. The local news had run a story about the alien exchange student, and suddenly their quiet life was under scrutiny. "I'll clean this up. Go back to bed," he told her. "They will return," Lyra said matter-of-factly. "Their hatred is predictable." The next morning, as James was boarding up the window, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a government number he didn't recognize. "Captain Miller, this is Dr. Elaine Waters from the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs." James balanced the phone against his shoulder as he continued working. "I don't believe I know that department." "We're newly formed," the woman replied. "In response to the growing number of Vex refugees being brought to Earth, I'm calling about Lyra." James stopped hammering. "What about her?" "We've received reports of harassment. We're also interested in her educational progress. The Vex possess advanced scientific knowledge that could be beneficial to humanity." "She's a teenager, not a database," James replied tersely. "Of course," Dr. Waters said smoothly. "But we'd like to interview her, run some cognitive assessments. All voluntary, naturally." After ending the call, James found Lyra sitting on the back porch, watching a pair of deer at the edge of the woods. "Earth animals do not fear me as humans do," she observed. "Interesting. Someone from the government wants to meet with you," James said, sitting beside her. "To run some tests." Lyra's posture stiffened. "Tests about what I know of Vex technology. They said it's about your education. But probably, yes. My father warned me this might happen," she said quietly. "Humans defeated the Vex through superior numbers and determination, not superior technology. Now, they will want what we know." James frowned. "Your father predicted this. It is why he chose you specifically," Lyra explained. "A soldier who showed mercy would also show judgment about what knowledge is safe to share." For the first time, James wondered if there was more to his inheritance than he'd realized. "What exactly do you know, Lyra?" She turned all 4 eyes to him. "Enough to advance human civilization by centuries, or destroy it completely." Before James could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Kate. "Turn on the news. Now." Inside, they found the local channel showing footage of a protest outside Pinnacrist High School. A dozen people carried signs reading "Earth for Humans" and "No Alien Infiltration." The leader of the protest group, calling themselves Human First, has demanded that alien refugees be relocated to a dedicated facility away from human population centers, the reporter explained. The camera zoomed in on a tall man with a military bearing. "These are not innocent refugees," he was saying. "They're the children of our enemies, being planted among us to learn our weaknesses." James recognized him with a jolt. Major Davis, a former coalition officer who had been discharged for excessive force against Vex civilians. "He knows who I am," Lyra said softly. "And what I might know." James turned off the TV and reached for his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. His old squadron commander, now working at coalition headquarters. "We've got trouble," he said when the call connected. "And I think it's bigger than just some xenophobic neighbors." The safe house was small but secure, tucked away in the mountains where the coalition maintained a hidden research facility. James sat at the kitchen table cleaning his service pistol, a habit from his military days that still calmed his nerves. Kate moved about the kitchen preparing a simple meal, while Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor, her 4 eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation. 3 days had passed since they'd fled their home. When James had spotted surveillance drones circling their property, he knew Major Davis and his Human First followers weren't simply making noise. They were preparing to act. How long do we stay here? Kate asked, keeping her voice low. Until Colonel Reeves completes his investigation, James replied. If Davis really has government connections like we suspect, we need to know who we can trust. Lyra's eyes opened suddenly. It is time I explained everything, she announced. James set down his weapon. I'm listening. Lyra rose gracefully to her feet and approached the table. From a pocket in her clothing, she withdrew a small crystalline object that glowed with a faint blue light. This is a Vex memory crystal, she explained. It contains the complete scientific and cultural knowledge of my family line, going back 17 generations. James stared at the small object. That's what they're after. Yes, my father was the leading physicist in the Vex Empire. His research on dimensional physics advanced our civilization beyond all others we had encountered. Lyra placed the crystal on the table. Until we met humans. I don't understand, Kate said, joining them. If your technology was so advanced, how did we win the war? Because my father refused to use his greatest discoveries as weapons, Lyra explained. He saw what humans had accomplished, how quickly you advanced, how determinedly you fought. He came to believe that our species were meant to evolve together, not destroy each other. James leaned forward. So when he gave you to me, it was never about an orphan child needing a guardian, Lyra confirmed. It was about finding someone worthy to receive our knowledge. The inheritance is not me, Captain Miller. The inheritance is what I carry. She touched the crystal again. In Vex culture, knowledge is passed from parent to child, master to student. My father searched through all the records of human commanders, looking for one who showed the wisdom to use power responsibly. And he chose me, James asked, incredulous. You spared civilians when you could have destroyed them. You treated prisoners with dignity. You fought fiercely, but never cruelly. Lyra's voice softened. He believed you would make the right choices about how this knowledge should be shared. Kate looked between them. So what do we do now? That depends on Captain Miller, Lyra said formally. The inheritance is his to accept or refuse. James stared at the small crystal. It seemed impossible that something so tiny could contain such power, knowledge that could transform humanity's future or lead to its destruction if misused. I'm just a soldier, he said quietly, not a scientist, not a politician. Precisely why you were chosen, Lyra replied. Scientists might be blinded by curiosity, politicians by ambition, but a soldier understands both the necessity of power and its cost. James thought of Major Davis and others like him, people who would weaponize this knowledge without hesitation. He thought of Dr. Waters and her government department, eager to extract Vex secrets without understanding their context or consequences. If I accept this responsibility, he said slowly, I need to understand exactly what it means. Lyra placed her six-fingered hand over the crystal. It means you become the bridge between our worlds. Not through conquest, but through understanding. You decide which knowledge is shared, when, and with whom. She looked at him steadily. It means you help guide both our species toward a future together, rather than apart. And if I refuse, then I will destroy the crystal and its knowledge will be lost forever. The room fell silent as James considered. Finally, he reached out and covered Lyra's hand with his own, both their hands now resting on the crystal. I accept, he said, not just for Earth, but for both our peoples. For the first time since he had known her, Lyra smiled fully, an expression that transformed her alien features into something unexpectedly beautiful. Then the inheritance is complete, she said, and our real work begins. 5 years had passed since the night James had accepted the crystal and everything it represented. The morning sun filtered through the windows of what had once been his small cabin, but now served as the main house of the Miller Vex Cultural Exchange Center. James stood on the expanded back porch, watching as a group of Vex and human children played together on the grass. Their laughter, so different in tone yet similar in meaning, filled the crisp morning air. Still hard to believe sometimes, isn't it? Kate asked, joining him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. James nodded, accepting one of the cups. If you told me during the war that I'd end up running a cultural exchange program with Vex children, I would have had you psychiatric evaluated. And yet here we are. Kate smiled, watching as a young Vex girl taught human children the complex hand movements of a traditional Vex greeting game. The path to this moment hadn't been easy. After accepting the crystal inheritance, James had faced opposition from multiple sides. Major Davis and his Human First movement had grown increasingly hostile until Colonel Reeves had uncovered evidence of their illegal surveillance and weapons stockpiling. The subsequent trial had exposed Davis's network of anti-alien extremists within the military and government. Meanwhile, Dr. Waters and her department had continued pressing for access to Vex technology. It had taken James nearly a year of negotiations, with support from more moderate government officials, to establish the current arrangement, a carefully controlled exchange of knowledge, with Lyra serving as the primary interpreter of Vex science. The new family arrives today, Kate reminded him. Their shuttle lands at noon. James nodded. The newest Vex refugees, a scientist and his 2 children, whose mother had been killed in the final days of the war, would bring their total to 17 Vex now living at the center. Is Lyra back from Washington? He asked. Late last night. She's showing the ambassador's daughter the translation matrix this morning. As if summoned by her name, Lyra emerged from the research building that had been constructed beside the main house. At 22, she had grown into her full Vex height, standing nearly 7 feet tall. She moved with the natural grace of her species, but now carried herself with a confidence that came from finding her place between 2 worlds. James, she called, spotting him on the porch. The matrix is functioning at optimal capacity. The ambassador believes we're ready for the medical technology exchange next month. James smiled as she bounded up the steps. Gone was the wary, frightened alien girl he had reluctantly inherited. In her place stood a powerful, brilliant young woman who had become the most effective diplomat between their species. And somewhere along the way, though neither had expected it, she had truly become his daughter. The council approved your proposal, Lyra continued excitedly. They're establishing exchange programs in 5 more Earth cities. That's your achievement, not mine, James replied proudly. Our achievement, Lyra corrected. The inheritance was never meant for just one person to carry. Later that afternoon, as the new Vex family settled into their quarters, James found himself walking through the center's memorial garden. Stone markers honored those who had fallen in the war, both human and Vex. At the center stood a sculpture representing the crystal that had started everything, now safely secured in a vault beneath the research facility. Lyra joined him silently, standing beside him as they both gazed at the names etched in stone. Do you think this is what my father hoped for? She asked quietly. James considered the question. I think he hoped for peace, for understanding, for his daughter to find a place where she could thrive. He turned to look at her. So yes, I think this is exactly what he hoped for. He would be proud of you, Lyra said, of what you've built here. What we've built, James corrected gently. This place exists because a war-weary soldier and a frightened alien girl both decided to trust each other. As the sun began to set, they walked back toward the main house where both human and Vex gathered for the evening meal, a tradition that blended elements from both cultures. James watched as Kate showed the newly arrived Vex children how to make Earth-style desserts adapted to their biology. The inheritance had been a responsibility, yes, but it had also become the foundation of a family none of them could have imagined. And in that unexpected gift, James had finally found the peace he'd been fighting for all along.